By the very end of the 19th century, the Royal Navy hadn't built an armoured cruiser in over a decade. This pattern would come to an end, however, in 1898, as a trio of classes were built in such quick succession that the first ship laid down in the first class wasn't even commissioned before the last ship of the third class had been laid down. The first two classes, the Cresseys and Drakes, were fairly typical armoured cruisers of the period, with the Drakes increasing in displacement and armament over the Cresseys. But, in a pattern typical through history, some people didn't like the expense, and so the Monmouths were designed as smaller, cheaper alternatives, primarily to counter a rash of commerce-raiding protected cruisers that other nations were building. This went about as well as could be expected. Savings, compared to the Drake class, began to tumble in thick and fast. As armoured cruisers were supposed to fight other cruisers, the speed, 23 knots, couldn't be dropped, but belt armour lost a couple of inches, half an inch came off the deck, the turrets had the same armour drop as the belt, and even the conning tower had a similar reduction. The big fore and aft guns that characterised armoured cruisers and were meant to give both the range and penetration that allowed them to fight others of their kind were also dropped. The result was a ship that displaced 9,800 tons and could make the design speed of 23 knots using 22,000 indicated horsepower, which was provided by a pair of vertical triple expansion engines driving 2 screws. Armament consisted of 14 6-inch guns, 4 in twin turrets laid out fore and aft in place of the more traditional 9.2-inch guns, and 10 in single casemates, 5 per side. But, in common with the Drakes and Cresseys, and to save space, these were arranged in a pair of double-stacked casemates towards each end and a single low-mounted casement amidships. Further firepower against torpedo boats and the like came from 10 single 12-pounder or 3-inch guns and 3 single 3-pounder or 47mm guns, and there were a pair of submerged torpedo tubes for larger targets, 1 per side. Armour was 4 inches thick on the main belt, turrets and barbettes, a maximum of 2 inches thick on the deck, and 10 inches on the conning tower. This left the Monmouths outranged and outgunned by more conventional armoured cruiser designs without any real ability to penetrate those ships' heavier armour. The twin turrets had issues maintaining a high rate of fire, and it turned out that the lower mounting points of many of the 6-inch guns were so close to the waterline that 3 out of the 5 casement guns per side were effectively unusable in heavy seas, unless you wanted to go the way of the Mary Rose or the Cronin. Conversely, they were at least significantly superior to the majority of the raiding-type protected cruisers that they were supposed to counter, if you quietly ignored the existence of any potential commerce-raiding armoured cruisers. Indeed, even as the design was being finalised, many in the Navy had deep misgivings about them, and a number of officers tried to simply get the Admiralty to build a few more Drakes instead. The final decision was somewhat split. The Drakes were increased from 2 ships to 4 ships, but the remaining funds went into the new Monmouth class, with more of them included the following year. 10 ships would be built: Monmouth, Bedford, Essex, Kent, Berwick, Cornwall, Cumberland, Donegal, Lancaster and Suffolk. All were laid down within 2 years of each other, all but Monmouth within 15 months of each other, from August 1899 to March 1901. They were launched between late 1901 and early 1903, and commissioned in 1903 and 1904. 9 ships would enter World War I, as HMS Bedford had been lost going aground thanks to a navigational error in 1910. Of the survivors, Admiral von Spee's campaign paradoxically damned and vindicated the class at the same time. Monmouth was one of the 2 armoured cruisers assigned to Admiral Craddock's squadron, and with much of her armament unworkable in high seas and the rest of it outranged and outpowered by the Scharnhorst 8.3-inch armament, she was rapidly destroyed with all hands at the Battle of Coronel. Conversely, 2 other ships of the class, Cornwall and Kent, would be on hand for the subsequent Battle of the Falkland Islands, where a combination of pouring anything that would burn into the British boilers and somewhat worn German machinery allowed them to overhaul the smaller Leipzig and Nuremberg respectively. The British 4-inch plate proved effective at protecting them against German 4.1-inch guns for the most part, and both German ships would be sunk. Kent would also take part in the subsequent sinking of HMS Dresden in the aftermath of the battle. These were exactly the kind of targets the Monmouths had been built to counter, and both Cornwall and Kent proved somewhat more capable against them than the more modern and faster Glasgow, which, although it could overhaul the German targets a lot more easily, had to play things a little bit more cagily since it was vulnerable to 4.1-inch return fire. Nonetheless, partly as a result of their anti-commerce radar design role and partly due to acknowledgement of both their age and general weakness, the rest of the Monmouths served through the rest of the war almost entirely on distant patrol and later convoy escort duties, with occasional appearances in various secondary theatres. None would be involved in any of the major engagements that would occur in the North Sea. As the war wound down, they were rapidly moved into non-active roles such as accommodation ships, and then scrapped at the start of the 1920s, with Kent seeing the last active duty in brief operations in support of the White Russians in 1919.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.